Party composition. It's how we turn a ragtag group of adventurers into a world-class dragon hunting squad, or else argue with our friends over whose turn it is to build a healer after everyone showed up to the table with a DPS build. Conventional wisdom suggests that a carefully constructed party is key to success in D&D, but how important is it really? How far can we stretch the definition of a viable adventuring party, and what forbidden fruit might we discover when we completely abandon all semblance of classical party balance? To get an idea of what's typical in D&D, let's take a look at the updated 5th edition rules found in the 2024 Player's Handbook. On page 36, we find the Balanced Party sidebar, which recommends the classic Cleric, Fighter, Rogue, Wizard combo, since it brings a balanced mix of capabilities to adventures. If just picking the classic 4 sounds boring, the book also lists particular classes to swap out, such as replacing the Cleric with a Bard or Druid. With a little math, we can see there's 180 possible combinations using these rules, so there's plenty of options for customization while still doing a little to narrow down the 11,880 unique 4-class parties you could build without repeating any classes. Personally, I think this sidebar is a great resource for starting players, who can use it to quickly put together a solid adventuring party while mitigating the risk of overlooking an essential ability or skill set within their ranks. That said, I could see experienced players finding these guidelines to be somewhat restrictive, and it is rather funny that 3 of the 4 slots feature the Bard as an alternative. According to these rules, 3 Bards and a Barbarian is a perfectly viable party build. And that got me thinking, what's to stop a group of players from getting really weird with their party composition? This is where I'd like to shake things up by introducing SCPs to D&D. And by SCPs, I mean single-class parties. In this context, an SCP is what would happen if those 3 bards ditched the barbarian to make a barter-shop quartet for fun and profit, or if a group of 4 wizards got together to make a book club that also melted the odd goblin horde with the power of their minds on the weekends. Now, I'm not claiming to be the first person to suggest building an entire adventuring party from just one class, but in my experience the idea is typically brought up as a joke, and I want to change that. So let's take a look at SCPs and consider whether they could actually be a viable way to play the game, starting with the challenges we're going to face if we try this at our game table. The first challenge with playing D&D with an SCP is about the mechanics of the game itself, and it's probably the most obvious to those of you watching. The issue here is that if all 4 characters have the same class, they're going to have some notable weaknesses that are much harder to patch up than those of a classic party. What happens to a group of fighters when they run low on hit points? Who will stop a group of wizards from getting squished by the first troll they meet? What happens when a party of sorcerers faces a beholder's anti-magic field? Now, any player bringing melee weapons to fight a monster with wings and ranged attacks could tell you that getting hard countered isn't new to D&D, but it's not often that an entire party of heroes has no answer to an encounter. 1 or 2 characters may struggle to contribute meaningfully in any given fight, but they'll get their chance to shine later on, and in the meantime their friends will probably have something to bring the situation under control. With an SCP, however, it's a lot more likely that the entire party gets hard countered. If one character is having a hard time, they probably all are. Even outside of combat, a party that lacks significant skill diversity could really struggle. Read any of the numerous classic dungeon crawls and official D&D modules, and you're sure to find a slew of secret rooms and hidden magical goodies that would be nigh impossible to access without a rogue to pick all the locks and disable all the traps. This kind of design is so prevalent in pre-written adventures that it's hard not to consider lockpicking a mandatory skill to have somewhere in the party, meaning a rogue or at least a bard is essential. Any party that doesn't have one would have a huge blind spot, and that's just one example of the various skills and abilities it would be hard to do without. Double, triple, or even quadruple up on classes, and you're bound to have a lot of redundant skills, while others are ignored entirely. Game mechanics aside, there's another flaw to playing an SCP, and that's the social toll of repeating classes. In a classic party, every character has an area of expertise where only they excel, giving them opportunities to shine where others can't. Need to smooth talk a guard? The bard's got your back. The giant won't let you pass unless you beat him at thumb wrestling? The barbarian's happy to oblige. No one can understand what the extraplanar entity is saying? The warlock knows deep speech, and they've been itching for a chance to freak their friends out with it. When everyone has a defined role, they might feel constrained by their lane from time to time, but that's their lane, and they don't often have to worry about other players showing them up at things they're good at. That changes when everyone is playing the same class. Who gets to track a fleeing monster in a party of 4 rangers? Which paladin gets to challenge the dastardly villain to a duel? Which cleric gets to break out Summon Celestial or Flame Strike rather than saving their highest slot for Mass Cure Wounds? With too much overlap, it's hard to feel like your character is unique and valuable, and it can be frustrating to see an opportunity to do something cool disappear because one of your friends jumps on it first. And that leads into a similar issue for the DM. How are we supposed to keep problems interesting when the moments that make each player feel powerful are all the same? A DM for a classical party might design their adventures with something for everyone. A magical secret for the wizard here, a melee slugfest for the fighter there, but when everyone is running the same class, that space gets narrower. Instead of a mixture of challenges that gives everyone a chance to shine, the DM needs to design each encounter to play to a limited set of abilities offered by the party. Boredom is the most obvious consequence here, but there's another that I see as a possible result of this narrowed design space. I come from a teaching background, and in that field there's a lot of discussion about teaching to the test, the post-No Child Left Behind idea that students aren't being taught how to apply their learning beyond the classroom. Rather, they're given rote drills on specific information and language not to understand it, but to uncritically regurgitate it on the next standardized test. What was supposed to be the measure of the lesson's success instead becomes its goal, an imitation of learning with none of the benefits of the real thing. Where a teacher might drill their students on test taking without enabling independent thought, the DM for an SCP runs the risk of baking intended solutions into each scenario they write. Rather than creating open-ended problems that any member of the party could solve by applying their own unique talents in a variety of unforeseen ways, our DM in this scenario may find themselves throwing softballs at their players. Perhaps they map out a stealth-based infiltration job in the style of Metal Gear Solid for their party of rogues, with lots of fun heist cliches and tense sneaking scenes along the way. It's a cool idea in theory, but if the players didn't decide this was the way to go on their own, if kicking down the door and fighting their way in isn't an option at all, then they may get the sense they're being pandered to, or even railroaded into a particular path, rather than feeling clever for coming up with ways to apply their own diverse set of talents to a tricky scenario. It wasn't really them who did something cool, rather, they just did what the DM expected them to. When we lay out all the reasons like this, what we already know about D&D becomes even more clear. SCPs aren't the intended game experience, and they have the potential to introduce a lot of problems. Honestly, every time I review this list, I find it hard not to get discouraged. Perhaps the untrodden path has remained untrodden for a reason. And yet, I'm still left with some hope that there might be something worth doing here, and I find the encouragement I need when I consider some of the other TTRPGs on my shelf. Monster of the Week, for instance, features classes in a less restrictive way, with core actions or moves that could be performed by any member of the party, regardless of class. Slug Blaster, on the other hand, treats classes more like common story arcs, meaning your class can influence your character's goals and personality, but has little bearing on what they can actually do in normal gameplay. And then there's Merc Baree, which does fantasy dungeon crawling just fine without classes at all, and only includes them in the core book as an optional add-on. If these other games can succeed with little to no emphasis on class variety, what's to stop D&D from working when players double-dip on classes? It might be an uphill battle, but there are actually some exciting reasons why playing the game this way could be a rewarding experience. Your own mileage may vary, but in my opinion there's more reasons to give it a try than there are reasons not to. Let's take a look. Most of my initial concerns with SCPs were based on the idea that, because every player had the same class, characters would be too alike to facilitate good gameplay and roleplay. However, it's important to remember that a class isn't a monolith. It's a frame on which you can build your own unique character. And just because you and another player are using the same skeleton doesn't mean the meat on those bones is going to be the same. Sure, there's bound to be significant overlap between their abilities, but D&D classes are designed with a lot of flexibility in mind, and SCPs can actually be a chance to let that intra-class diversity shine. Spellcasting classes present us with a great example of this in action. Let's say I'm playing a sorcerer, and I've just hit 5th level, so I get to learn my first 3rd level spell. I look over the list and find Hypnotic Pattern, which catches my attention because the ability to incapacitate a group of enemies seems powerful, and because I like the idea of halting the advance of my enemies with the power of disco lights. While this is the spell I really want, I might worry about passing up on the more obvious choices on the sorcerer's spell list. Haste is an excellent buff for allies. Counterspell and Dispel Magic are both staples for dealing with spellcasters and other magical effects, and of course there's always Fireball, everyone's favorite AoE damage powerhouse. With all these great options, can I really justify taking Hypnotic Pattern, or would I just be letting my friends down because I wanted to go against the grain? Well, in an SCP, I'd be safe in the knowledge that not only could anyone and everyone else take Fireball if they like, but I'm also contributing to the overall utility of the party by taking different spells than my friends. Here, spells are just one element of your build, but you can substitute in any of the other decisions you get to make for your character. Species, background, equipment, and feats are all great examples of ways you can differentiate your character from those of your friends, even if you are playing the same class. Perhaps the biggest impact comes from your character's subclass. Now, I started playing D&D in 5th edition and haven't had a chance to try anything older, but my understanding of prior editions is that class roles were much more rigidly defined back in the day. If you were playing a fighter, your job was to hit things with a sword until they died, and not much more. If you were playing a cleric, your job was to patch up your friends, and you better hope you liked healing, because there wasn't much else for you to do when combat rolled around. That's obviously an oversimplification, but my point is that everyone in the party had a role to play that was defined almost entirely by their class, and the game tended to reinforce the need to stick to that role, that critical role, while limiting opportunities for play outside of it. Today, however, there's a lot of ways to build a cleric. Sure, they're often the best healer in the party, but they also have enormous battlefield utility, and they can lay down some hurt as well. A big part of that flexibility comes from subclasses, a huge choice for your build that can distinguish your character from others of the same class. There's overlap to be sure, but a cleric of the life domain is going to feel very different from one of the war domain, and the trickery domain feels different as well. Build an SCP in 5e, and you don't just have 4 clerics. Instead, you've got 4 practitioners of vastly different traditions, each with their own unique talents, personalities, and even weaknesses. In short, you've got yourself a classic adventuring party. One of the biggest inspirations for this look at SCPs in the first place was the approach to subclasses in the 2024 Player's Handbook, which features exactly 4 choices for each of the 12 core character classes. Sure, the wizard might have fewer options than were available in the 2014 book, but most other classes got an upgrade, meaning the overall selection is more robust than ever before. Every class already has exactly enough subclasses to form a 4-player SCP, making now the most convenient time in the last 50 years of D&D to try it out. In a way, I think that SCPs could actually be rather liberating, and that doesn't just apply to the choices made when building your character. It also has a big effect on the shape the game takes while you're playing. Consider the classic conflict between the loose cannon, chaotic neutral rogue and the buttoned-up lawful good paladin. If you play the game long enough, you're bound to end up on one side or the other of this sort of party conflict at some point, and it can lead to some high tensions between players. Now, imagine that instead of playing a loose-moraled rogue in a party of goody-two-shoes heroes, you instead get to play with 3 other rogues, all of whom are just as down as you for a little smash-and-grab thievery. Freed from the moral yoke of traditional adventuring, you could play an adventure, arc, or even an entire campaign about a group of ne'er-do-wells looking for their next score while expanding the reach and influence of their shadowy thieves guild. Or, if striking heroic poses on conveniently placed hilltops while monsters flee before you is more your thing, you could play with a whole squad of paladins, each equally devoted to wiping the stain of evil from the land to make it safe for the common folk who rely on your order for protection. These sorts of high-concept adventures aren't exclusive to SCPs, but they do help facilitate certain flavorful narratives while fast-tracking everyone's shared understanding of what kind of game you're going to be playing. The benefits here extend to the DM as well. Consider the difference between the high-concept games I just outlined and official pre-written material. Those adventures can be great, and I've had a lot of fun running them, but their gameplay can also be somewhat safe and generic, and that's by design. After all, published adventures need to appeal to a general audience, not just in terms of individual tastes, but also different party compositions. Locked doors and hidden treasure stashes are a staple in official modules, but you'll never see a quest that requires a rogue's talents to proceed, because you can't guarantee a rogue will be available in every party. Meanwhile, an adventure that's homebrewed with specific players or characters in mind has the advantage of deliberately playing to the strengths and weaknesses of those characters. Similarly, if I write an adventure for an SCP, I can lean into particular themes, aesthetics, and styles of gameplay more strongly than would otherwise be possible or advisable. Here, it's certainly possible to run afoul of the teaching to the test problem I laid out earlier, but when done well, there's a great opportunity for gameplay that has a strong enough directorial hand to be flavorful and specific without being so straightforward as to be obvious or unchallenging. There's also a great opportunity here not just to play to a class's strengths, but also to its weaknesses. Consider a classic murder mystery, a la Holmes or Poirot. One of the biggest challenges with designing a detective story in D&D is the impact of magic on investigation. No witnesses to tell you who the killer is? Well, the warlock took Speak with Dead, so as long as the victim saw who killed them and still has an intact jaw, the mystery has been solved. Or maybe one of the guests is secretly a shape-shifting fiend, and the adventure is about piecing together clues to figure out who that is, until the paladin uses their divine sense, and just like that knows it was, in fact, the butler who did it. Or maybe the killer covered all their tracks near perfectly, but they didn't account for a cleric who can just cast Commune to ask an omniscient god to check the innocence of 3 different suspects in 1 minute flat. True, there's still plenty of ways to create engaging mysteries in D&D, but a closed-room murder mystery would be very difficult to write for the public in this system, unless, for instance, you knew that the entire party was going to be made up of monks who would be out of their depth in a scenario that didn't allow them to punch or backflip over their problems. Then, you might be able to pull it off. All of these examples demonstrate what I find to be the most interesting opportunity presented by an SCP, the ability to design around strict constraints. One of the most useful things I learned while pursuing my degree in creative writing was the idea that building constraints into a project doesn't limit creativity, but rather enables it. Whether it was designing a new adventure module or writing a short story for a school project, I'm sure we've all been in a place where the sheer weight of a blank sheet of paper has induced palpable dread. What do you write when the possibilities are limitless? How do you start working on something that has no shape or form yet? Well, what you need to get started are some specific constraints. For instance, when I'm creating the next D&D adventure for my home game, I'm rarely working from a truly blank slate. I already have an idea of the ideal challenge rating for enemy monsters, the tone of the game up until this point, the experience level of my players, and the overarching story I'm trying to tell, in addition to some knowledge on the tastes and preferences of the individual players, so I can create something they'll find fun and engaging. All these factors seem like limits on my creativity, but they actually give me a starting place for my design rather than an intimidatingly blank canvas. Similarly, designing for an SCP provides quite the powerful constraint. How do I design an adventure that appeals to the core fantasy of a specific class while remaining fun throughout, even with significant overlap between character abilities? I don't have a perfect answer to that yet, but I know that designing around that constraint is going to be a challenge, and one that's sure to push me to places I might not otherwise go. It's an exciting prospect, and one that makes me eager to start writing some adventures for SCPs. I've got some plans I want to share to that end, but first, because this premise isn't already crazy enough, let's introduce one more design constraint. And for that, we need to take a look at the monster manual. At the time of recording, I've just recently gotten my hands on the 2025 Monster Manual. More than anything else in D&D, a good monster gets my creative gears turning, which is why I've got a giant stack of monster books on my shelf that I frequently page through as I hunt for just the right creature to inject some life into my next adventure. I often place constraints before I start paging through my books, such as deciding on the location where the monster will be encountered, or a rough idea of what its plan is. That way, I won't be quite as overwhelmed by the choices before me, and I'm a lot more likely to be confident about my choice of monster when I find one that matches the criteria I've laid out. One of the best tools I have in this endeavor is a monster's creature type, that little tag by the monster's name that tells you which broad bucket of monster flavors it belongs in. Fae, Fiends, and Celestials all feel very different from one another. So a quick way to find the right monster is to search through the bucket that feels most right for the story you're writing, then narrow down your options from there. To those of you paying attention, the connection is probably pretty obvious at this point. Why not take our massive single-class party design constraint one step further by also limiting ourselves to a single type of monster that appears in the ensuing adventures? As soon as I had this idea, I felt all the stars aligning, because, get this, not only are there exactly 12 core character classes in D&D, but there's also 14 creature types. Seems like a missed opportunity, to be honest, but what are you gonna do? It's not like there are any other classes out there that could get in on this to keep things balanced, so we'll just have to plow ahead for now. Anyway, it's not as perfect as I would like, but it's still cool that there's enough creature types that I could create an adventure for every one of the 12 SCPs, each one also featuring just one monster type. That way, they feel doubly different from the others in the catalog, appeal more strongly to the class's core fantasy, and present an additional constraint on my process to enable creativity. And you know what? I think that's exactly what I'm going to do. At the end of the day, D&D wasn't designed with SCPs in mind, but that doesn't mean they can't be worth playing around with. The game's mechanics might run more smoothly and require less consideration with a classically balanced party, but going against the norm presents some fun challenges and unique opportunities both for the design of an adventure and also the play space within one. So, here's the brief I'm giving myself. Over the next year, I'm going to produce a series of 12 more videos exploring this topic. In each one, I'm going to look at a specific core class and explore the challenges and opportunities it presents as an SCP. I'll match that class with whichever of the 14 monster types most suits its theme and aesthetics, build a character sheet using each of the 4 subclasses in the 2024 Player's Handbook, then create an adventure tailored to them and share it with my viewers. What monster types match each of the classes? Well, to find out, you'll need to check out the other videos in the series when they release. But don't worry, I'm already working on the first one. Which class is it? Well, to save myself the trouble of puzzling that out too long, and to prevent myself from just starting with my favorite classes, we'll go in alphabetical order, starting with the Barbarian. That video should be out before long, but if you'd like something else to hold you over until then, I'll include a couple of links to my prior works in the description below. Anyway, that's enough self-promotion from me, and I've got some writing to do. Until next time, I'm Kevin Helock, and this has been Skill Point. Thanks for watching.